Captain Midnight.
It feels strange to start this video on the legacy of Stan Lee talking about something that he didn't like very much. After all, Stan was many things, and one of them was a very enthusiastic showman. It was pretty rare to see him say anything less than positive about something Marvel related. The next issue, the big upcoming movie, the new line of toys, whatever it was, Lee generally talked about them with such high hopes, almost always adopting this attitude of, they're gonna be great, just wait and see. Sometimes he was right, and sometimes he wasn't. But one project he couldn't muster much enthusiasm for was the 1977 Spider-Man TV show on CBS. And I focus on this because I think his reasoning why tells us a lot about Stan Lee and what he valued in fiction, so I'll let him explain.
With Spider-Man, I felt that the people who did the live-action series left out the very elements that made the comic book popular. They left out the humor, they left out the human interest and playing up the personality and characterizations and personal problems. On a technical level, I think they did a good job. I mean, the scenes of him climbing on the walls, and in those days, they didn't have the wherewithal that they have today, and they did a very good job of that. But to me, it was just a one-dimensional show.
Humor, personality, characters with real problems, these were at the foundation of Stan Lee's writing and career. It seems simple now, but he, along with some of the absolute best artists of their day, brought a humanity to their comic book characters that just didn't exist in these larger-than-life stories before that. And yeah, I know you've probably heard that in some form before, but I think this week, as sad as it is the best possible time to really dig into Stan Lee's life and how he was so much more than just the guy from a few lovable movie cameos. Stan Lee, or Stanley Lieber as he was known back then, was born in 1922 in, of course, New York City. His parents were Jewish immigrants from Romania. His father was a tailor, but that work quickly dried up after the Depression hit, and soon his family, including his younger brother Larry, were living in a small apartment in the Bronx. And by all accounts, his family life was pretty tense, and not something that he tended to talk about much. Finding odd jobs to keep the family afloat was very important, even when he was a little kid. But it was escaping into classic novels, and especially movies, that Lee seems to really focus on when telling his life story. Errol Flynn, the original big screen Robin Hood, was especially important to the preteen Stan, and when you watch those performances, it's really easy to see what appealed to him. Flynn wasn't just a square-jawed hero. He was a rogue, an arrogant swashbuckler who almost feels like an early, more innocent version of Tony Stark in a way. And kids across America loved him for it. So it's pretty undeniable that this Robin Hood was a huge inspiration behind how Lee thought about heroes. But I think there's another aspect of Stan Lee's life that kind of goes under the radar when talking about what made him such an important writer. The young Stan was hired by Marvel, then Timely Comics, when he was a teenager. He rose through the ranks to be an editor pretty quickly, but it wasn't until he was nearly 40 that he co-created the Fantastic Four with Jack Kirby. And those years in between are, in my opinion, the most overlooked period of Stan Lee's life. Because it's in this period that Lee became bored of comic books, which in a weird way turned out to be exactly what he needed. He had spent years writing stories and dialogue for the kind of heroes that he loved as a kid, but he was older now and he was getting kind of tired of it. And it seems like it was around this time that he started becoming more interested in what happened between the panels. What was Miss America doing after she hung up the cape at night? How did the Destroyer manage to pay the rent when he was so busy battling Nazis at home and abroad? These were probably not the questions that a younger Stan Lee was all that interested in, but by his late 30s, they were a huge part of what compelled him to dig deeper into his characters' personalities, giving them really human foibles that readers could recognize from their own lives. If you're watching this, my guess is you know the story. Through the years, you've probably even heard Stan tell it multiple times.
The Fantastic Four started in a funny way. My then publisher was playing golf with the publisher of DC Comics, although in those days they called it National Comics. And he told him that they had a comic book called the Justice League, and it was selling very well.
And maybe we ought to do a book with a lot of superheroes.
So I had been ready to quit. I figured enough
I'm a grown man now. I shouldn't stay in the comic field any longer. And my wife said, before you quit, just for fun,
why don't you do the next book you do the way you want to do it, just for fun? The worst that happens is you'll be fired, and you want to quit, so what's the big deal?
So I figured, okay, if we have to do a team, that's fine, but we're going to do it differently than anybody else does it.
It's a great story, but it came years and years after work in the comic book trenches that are often forgotten. At the age of 39, Stan Lee was one of two men who revolutionized how comics, and really how heroes in popular media, were written forever. And I don't know about you, but I think that's a lot more interesting than any story of an overnight sensation. When you go through the work that Lee did with Kirby and Ditko, some common through lines emerge. Spider-Man, The Thing, the Hulk, so many of these heroes have powers that bring huge problems into their lives. Just as much, if not more, than they bring excitement. Even an old Kirby co-creation, Captain America, was reborn as a more troubled figure, a man out of time, constantly questioning his place in a country he could no longer really understand. Kirby brought so much imagination and momentum to his art and storytelling style, and Ditko brought a lot of grounded realism and angst to his, and Lee brought the humor and the heart. I debated even bringing this up, but I'm going to anyway, I guess. In the last day or two, I've seen a lot of articles about Stan Lee's complicated or troubled legacy. Was he really the lovable grandpa of comics that so many Marvel fans think of him as, or was he something darker? And that kind of frustrates me, because the truth seems pretty obvious to me. Stan Lee, like so many of the characters he had a hand in creating, wasn't a perfect person. In the early years of Marvel's golden age, the press was very eager to give the charismatic editor all of the credit, and Lee was a little too happy to have it, and he took a bit too much. And that really hurt Kirby, Kirby's wife, and Ditko. I'm definitely not going to minimize any of that, or say it didn't happen. Or for that matter, pretend that Kirby and Ditko were treated fairly by Marvel, because they weren't. In fact, all three of these guys deserved far more of the profits from their work than they ended up getting. But for decades now, Stan Lee has been sure to mention the great artists he worked with, and give them credit at pretty much any opportunity. And if you look at everyone's work after that period of collaboration, it becomes very clear who should get credit for the golden age of Marvel. All of them. They all brought something to the table. Just like you couldn't remove George or Paul from the Beatles and still have the music we know today, the same can be said of the original Marvel bullpen. It was all of them, in that moment, that made the Marvel Universe possible. As you probably know, Jack Kirby passed away in 1994. Steve Ditko died earlier this year, and now Stan Lee has too, after paying tribute to his fellow Spider-Man co-creator just a few short months ago.
Steve was certainly one of the most important creators in the comic book business.
The creative giants of the Marvel Age of Comics are all gone. There's something very sad about that. Really, it's the end of an era. But I would at least hope that it would allow everyone to put the decades-old disputes between these men in the past and appreciate what they did create together. Some of the most iconic and durable characters of all time. And when I think of Stan Lee, I don't just think of the writer, the editor, the showman, the face of Marvel, or the narrator of so many things from my childhood. He was all of those things, and probably a few more. But most of all, at least speaking for myself, Stan Lee was a guy who really liked people. That really came shining through in his work. That message may seem simple, because it is. But in the end, I think that's what Stan Lee did best. Conveying something universal and fundamentally decent to people of all ages looking for heroes in a complicated world.
Hey out there in Marvel-land, face front, this is Stan Lee speaking. You've probably never heard a record like this before because no one would be nutty enough to make one with a bunch of offbeat artists, so anything is liable to happen.
Hey, who made you a disc jockey, Lee?
Well, Jolly Jack Kirby, say a few words to the fans, Jackson.
Okay, a few words.
Look,